Well, I've been cold all day, so that's brilliant. JD, I think you were going to expense the 75-inch TV, weren't you?
That's my plan.
21-year-old Glenn Goyne seems like another one for list for me. Well, let's see how this goes then. This is my third Fireside chat. It's the first one I've got anywhere close to a fire. If you remember last year in Sicily, it was more like a waterlogged chat. And I hope everyone has now not got webbed feet anymore. What am I going to talk about? A bit about some announcements. They're called Andy's announcements because they're not formal ones from the Dyalog, or they're not important enough, but they're ones I'd like to mention. Talk a bit about updating Dyalog, and as ever, miscellaneous minutiae, little things that I think are interested in Dyalog. A couple of gotchas. I'll cut that down from a group to a couple. And I was going to talk about Ride, but I'd rather have the wind taken out of my sails there. So, 16.0 onwards on Linux, and by Linux in this talk I mean Linux on Intel or AMD. If I use the word Pi, I mean Linux specifically on Pi. Linux means Intel and AMD. We will only issue 64-bit Unicode. That is our intention. So we will no longer issue 32-bit, and we won't issue Classic either. And that brings that in line with OS 10. For the Raspberry Pi, at the moment, the Raspberry Pi 3 is a 64-bit hardware machine, but I don't think there's a 64-bit version of the Raspbian operating system available. So we will continue to do a 32-bit version. When we can create a 64-bit interpreter, we will gently persuade you to move to that, but we'll keep doing the 32-bit one until 32-bit hardware kind of disappears off the planet. And on AIX, we currently produce a interpreter specially for Power 5, Power 6, Power 7, and next time around it'll be 6, 7, and 8. And we're going to look at just doing one in generic interpreter because we're not convinced anymore that the performance difference is worth it. And it would be interesting to know from our AIX users what is the lowest CPU version that they actually would like to have version 16 running on. If no one's using less than Power 7, then we'll skip the Power 6. Here I get on to things that kind of just mentioned in passing. Quad N parts allows you to take a file name and break it into its directory, the file name and its extension. And if you do one quad N parts quote quote, it tells you what your current working directory is. So that may be a useful one to have. For our APLX users, we have extended quad N read and quad N replace in version 15, and that was done after the first version of first set of installation images of 15. So there's an update to be had there, and effectively we are now, get this one right. Quad N replace the negative one there says replace from the current location in the file, and Quad N read, as it does on APLX, says read from the current location in the file to the end of the file. Okay. Do be aware, if you're reading multi-byte things, in this case a 2-byte signed integer, if, for example, there was an odd number of bytes left in the file, that last byte is going to get lost because it doesn't make up a complete byte, a 2-byte integer. And a little thing that I've found over the last year, if you are using Quad N read a lot, and so it's only reading native files, do investigate using Quad Map, because in many cases it is much, much faster. So it's a good one to have a look at. SQAPL, this was going to be a much longer section, but it got cut down for many reasons. SQAPL has been available for many years. It allows you to share data between APL and SQL databases. And that also includes an option to have Dyalog APL pretend that it is an SQL database. It's been available for Windows and for Linux on Pi in version 15. And you can get it for AIX, but that requires a separate license because of the ODBC managers that we use. We have to buy licenses ourselves. We are now adding SQAPL to OS 10, Mac OS. Jay has been using it, Jay Whipple's been using it for a few weeks, I think, haven't you? A month. It will certainly be in 16. It may be in future 15.0 installation images. There is some interesting caching going on that Bjorn and I are a little confused about to make sure we understand exactly what's going on. And SQAPL these days, on any platform we will support SQL on, you can talk to MySQL and similar databases such as MariaDB. If you are on Windows or Linux, you can now use SQAPL to talk to SQL Server on Windows. Microsoft released support for the ODBC driver for Linux, and that works fine with SQAPL. And if you're on AIX or Windows, we know of customers who talk to Oracle. If there are any other combinations that anyone's using, we'd dearly love to know so we can tell people about them. Some changes in 16. On Windows, if you type lib in 15.0 and earlier, the name of the directory always appears in uppercase. The name of the files appear in the case you actually created the file. And we thought that why don't we in 16 have the correct casing for the library name as well. That means that the Windows version is brought into line with all other platforms. In 16, the syntax checking the interpreter does on control structures is more strict. So in 15 and earlier, you could type expressions like :if one, and if one, or :else divide 0. If you look at the description in the documentation or the syntax diagram, that is strictly an error. And in 16, we will enforce it. So you must have :if one, diamond, and if one, or :else, diamond, divide 0, or put those two on separate lines. So that means if you load a 15.0 workspace and run it, you may get errors. And if you look at the functions in the editor will highlight the control structures in red to indicate that they're in error themselves. And a minor thing, Quad FR and Quad DCT in 16 will have namespace scope rather than workspace scope. And that's mainly because Quad CT itself has namespace scope, and we thought to bring those in line. Something we thought about doing for a few releases and have finally done it. On Windows, in 15, we introduced a non-admin install. Not just install, but also the ability to apply updates to the Windows versions without needing admin rights. That's great because it means that if you have a lockdown PC in an organisation, you can probably install APL and update it without having to involve the IT department too much. However, because it's a non-admin install, we can't install the IME, and we can't install the APL 385 in the Windows font cache. And that means that Dyalog APL is the only application that you can type APL into, or you can see the APL characters. If you want to do more than that, you're going to have to do some more work. And we don't and the Visual Studio 2015 redistributors are not installed. I think Roger mentioned that version 15 is compiled with Visual Studio 2015. If you're running on, I think, Windows Vista and some Windows 7s, you may still need admin rights to install those. On later versions of the operating system, they're already in place. And the biggest thing to spot is, for a non-admin install, you're installing it for your user and your user alone. So if you have a machine that has multiple users on it, each of them will end up with their own installed copy of Dyalog APL. So that's, whatever it is, 100 megabytes a shot. And it also means that you have an administrative matter of saying, how can I make sure that all of those users are using exactly the same interpreter? If you do a system-wide install with admin rights, you've only got one interpreter to worry about. We are thinking of changing the way we update Dyalog APL in version 16. Currently, if you're running on a Raspberry Pi, we have an online repository, and you can do an apt-get update. On AIX, you ask us for a tar file and install from that. Actually, I think it might be a CPIO file sometimes. Depends on what version it is and what mood we're in. On OS 10, you can download new PKG files from my.dyalog.com if you have a DSS pass. And on Linux, we supply an RPM and a deb file in a zip file from my.dyalog as well. And on Windows, we have this patch wizard, which effectively downloads .dpf files for the 2 interpreters and the 2 DLLs, and that's the runtime and the development interpreter, and you can apply those patches. On Linux, the plan is to create an RPM and a deb repository so that it works very similar to the way it works on the Pi. And on Windows, we're thinking of issuing update.msi files So we update not just the interpreter files, but all the other files as well. That is probably fine for most users, but there'll be some users who only want to update individual files, and we'll either keep the patch mechanism or do something similar to say, you only want to upgrade the interpreter, or you only want to upgrade this one individual file, this is how you do it. We'd love to, well, at least I would, others might as well, like to hear comments on what you think about this this weekend going forwards. So, I have never yet done an Uncle Andy's Fireside chat. If only that was brandy or whiskey. I've never yet done this without talking about the editor first of all, so here we go. Morten alluded a few minutes ago to the problems of updating Dyalog APL or looking at a file from within Dyalog APL and having it reformatted, and therefore it causes problems for version control systems. Some of you do not want APL to reformat scripted objects, or scripts rather, and some of you really, really do. And we had a bit of a to-do about that. Eventually we said, okay, we'll add an option in the menus to allow you to decide whether you want to do that or not. The next 3 points I think I'll demonstrate with an APL. So, first of all, just very quickly, here is an APL function, and I'm in the editor looking at a function, and here you see I have an option for choosing which of the syntax colouring styles I would like to, schemas I want to use. In this case, patently obviously I want APL, but I've also got the choice of saying show me as JSON, show me as XML, or turn syntax colouring off altogether. We added an option, Jay mentioned that the editor allows you to highlight when you have, effectively it shows you functions or lines that would not actually, the compiler could not deal with. And here we have a function here which tells me that this function cannot be compiled, and you can see it can't be because we haven't yet specified the value of R. So if I do R gets X, and at that point that would compile, so the vertical bar disappears at that point. We have an option to allow you to, when you search in the editor by default, as soon as you type something that hits a match, it highlights all of them. You may find that a bit fussy, and you can turn that off. I like it when Nick says he uses Vim. I'm a VI user. I've been a VI bigot all my life, and I shall remain so. And what happens in VI is that when you've searched for something, I then think, okay, I want to hide all these highlights, and what I do is just generally type rubbish like that. There's not going to be a match on that, so I don't have any highlighting. I think it was Adam who said that's really not the best way of doing things. So in version 16 there is an option. If you click on this little cross, it clears the search field. Thank you, John, for that. That was most appreciated.
I don't know if you want to mention, I think that's an option on the Quad WC edit field as well.
Okay, and apparently that's an option on the Quad WC edit field, says John. So you can create an edit field using in a form or something using Quad WC, and apparently there is now an option that is, I have no idea what the option is called, but presumably something like clear text or something like that, and effectively it puts that little cross up in the edit field for you. Right, anyone have any idea what the next slide is? Okay, that's those ones. And then we come to another feature we put in 15.0, which, as ever, we did a particularly bad job of telling anybody about. And if in Windows Explorer you enable the preview pane, and then you look at, for example, a Dyalog APL workspace, then in Windows Explorer we now show you something of the structure of the workspace. And if you look at the functions in there, you can actually see a function listing. You have not explicitly started Dyalog APL and loaded that workspace. In the background, it's using the runtime interpreter to achieve that. But effectively, you can see in the Windows Explorer, look at what's in the workspace and what the text is. That's in version 15 already. We may or may not have told you about that. And similarly, you can look at in the preview pane, here's a text file. In version 16, after a certain amount of comment from Mr. Jaeger in particular, we've allowed you, get the focus in the right place, we allow you to change the size of the font. Kai bought in a not 75-inch screen, but some great big screen with an extremely high resolution, and I was using a magnifying glass to be able to see that text, so we decided that allowing that would be a good idea. So that is the file previewer. Windows Explorer. Thank you to Michael Bass. That also works, he tells us, out of the box with Speed Commander, and on our forums he's put a posting telling you how to set up, however you pronounce that one. Explorer, okay, that's how you pronounce it. That needs a little bit of work, but that can be done as well. And I think, John, you say it works in the Outlook preview pane as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, so.
Sorry.
If you're running Outlook and somebody sends you an email that's got a workspace as an attachment, you can actually preview the content of that workspace in the pane of your Outlook email client without having to start an interpreter or doing anything else. And any other email client that would be compatible with the Windows mechanisms that do that.
Okay, thank you.
And it doesn't run any Quadlex or anything, or doesn't run any code in the workspace as it does that.
Okay, right. So that's the file previewer. And if you double click on a scripted file, so a .dialog file, it actually brings up the dialog editor. It's actually bringing up a runtime interpreter, bringing it up in the editor. So do be aware with both this and possibly more so the file previewer with workspaces, I think it uses a default maximum workspace of 64 megabytes. He says, pulling a number out there. It uses a default size. If your workspace won't fit, you'll end up with a blank screen. But that is just the normal dialog editor. You can change that text, and you can change the font size in 16, but not in 15. And file, save. And it would have changed. Yeah, save changes. And there we go. I've now got a blank line in my function. So all of those are version 15 things, which we didn't actually publicise as well as perhaps we might have done, as ever. We've also, we set up in 14.1, I think, you could change the window caption by defining things like I want to specify in the caption what the process ID is, what the workspace ID is, so on and so forth. And what we've done in 16, so here is my APL section. You see I've got the process ID in there. I find it invaluable putting the process ID in there because it's the only thing that uniquely identifies a particular process. And then when I come down here and I'm running Windows 7 and I hover over the dialog icon over there, it tells me that it's, obviously I've got the same caption, it tells me that that's the same process as that one. And that means that if I wish to send a interrupt to one of the 37 APLs running at the same time, rather than playing pick an icon, that one missed file, you can actually do that and you can get the right one. Of course, it's quite possible you then decided on picking the wrong one, but at least you can match them up. That's your problem, not ours.
Andy, before you go back to the PowerPoint, I don't know if you omitted this on purpose, but if you go back to, I wonder if you want to hover over the red line in the editor when there was a compile error. If you take that last line out, if you hover over that line, I believe it'll say it hasn't worked because you've not defined R. Did you not know that?
And when did that get added? And is that in the documentation?
The reason you've not seen that before is that usually my results are called RSLT, so that's why it's different.
Okay. Yes, not everything gets in the documentation because I don't necessarily know about it, and neither does Fiona. Well, that's kept the Windows users happy, so here's a very small one for the for the rest of us. In 14.1 and prior, if you call quad sh, and myCMD returns a non-zero exit code, i.e. it has got an error in it, you get a domain error. So you get none of the text back, you get a domain error, and you have no idea what was going on. In version 15, if you call quad.sh exit with a non-zero exit code, you've still got the domain error, but at least dmx.message puts the error code at the end of the text. Quad.sh is a wonderful thing, and this is possibly where I'm going to get a rotten tomato thrown at me from that direction. If you assign the result of quad.sh when it works, you get a valid thing, you get a vector of vectors, you get a vector of vectors, and they display as a vector of vectors. If you type quad.sh and do not assign the result in any way or form, it puts them out one under the other, so it looks exactly like the output of paren.sh. It's brilliant. That's my pitch for keeping it, Jeff, by the way. Jeff and I think it's brilliant. There are those around here who think it's horrible. It's very, very useful, says someone who's used this feature for 30 years. Right, Ibeam time. Again, a perennial favourite. At this point, I might as well go and sit down again, mightn't I? This is Uncle Andy's Fireside chat, as usual. We added a feature that allows you to disable traps in the session. And what that means is, when you are running a trad function, this only applies to trad functions, how many times have you traced into a trad fun, got to the point where you realise where your code's going wrong, go to the session, and you mean to say, okay, I want to type A plus gets 1, and you actually go and miss out. You make an error, you put a jot in there, it of course fires a trap at that point, and what happens is the trap is caught in your code, despite and your stack gets cut back 5 levels, and you mutter 1 or 2 words under your breath and start all over again. In version 15, you can either call 600 Ibeam 2 or under Windows options disable traps in sessions, and what that does is says when I have a suspended function and I generate an error in the session, the trap is not fired. I think that's brilliant. That is really, really helpful. Ibeam 1 is the default behaviour, and Ibeam 0 disables traps altogether. Don't, is all I can say to that, particularly if you're running the salt and the such like, anything where effectively, rather than saying, check to see if the file exists, and if it does do this, what salt does, not unreasonably, says attempt to do this operation on the file and traps the error. And if you disable all traps, good luck. You are now deep in the bowels of salt on the other side of the editor, and it all gets very, very nasty. Someone mentioned 819 Ibeam earlier. I think it was you, Jay, wasn't it, in the performance thing? Maybe, maybe not. 819 Ibeam does case conversion. It only works in Unicode interpreters, and it works on any shape depth array that is all character. In this case, I've chosen a simple 3-element vector of character vectors, and putting a 1 in front of it converts it to uppercase. Notice it does A to Z 0 to 9, and it's using the underlying using the underlying Unicode PCRE stuff, I think, to do this conversion. So it does many of the normal quoted letters, accented letters, and the such like. And 0 returns everything in lowercase. I demonstrated this at a BAA meeting. I believe it was upstairs at the Albion pub in central London early in the new year, and this got the biggest ooh please. And someone said, would you put it in 14.1? I said, oh, it's a 15.0 feature. At which point the dumb waiter appeared from 3 floors down at the bar, and a round of pints appeared on the desk, and I was given one. I said, okay, I'll see what I can do. Went back to the office and with a bit of wheedling and that sort of thing, and threatening that if I didn't get it, I'd make life hell for people. It was put in 14.1. So 819 Ibeam Unicode interpreters from 14.1, 27.141 and onwards. And that's on all platforms, I believe. Last year, I went on and on and on about how arrays are saved in Dyalog APL, and how one pocket points to another, and mentioned that, for example, quad DM, quad DMX, we don't convert quad DM, quad DMX into strings, i.e. stringify. What a wonderful word that is. We only do that in 14.1 and prior, when you reference quad DM. In 15.0 onwards, we do it at a 6-space prompt during a save operation, also quad DM, And what that means is that rather than the interpreter holding the pockets necessary to build the DM information, it can free them up immediately. So that means when you save a workspace, there's a much greater chance that you're going to have a smaller file on disk because you're not holding up namespaces that you may have already erased but are necessary to generate DM, and that may mean you're getting rid of information you don't actually want to be saved to disk. If you want to see how all that works, that was in last year's Fireside chat. If you go to the Dyalog website, you can find both my slides and the video nasty that accompanies it. And from that, there may be one or two people who rather like this, and that is that if you type call quad signal 0 in 16.0, quad EN, quad DM, and quad DMX are reset. Okay. Very simple. Oops. Here we go. Here's this gets a domain error. So if this effectively we have a non-empty DMX, DM is a 3-element vector of character vectors, quad signal 0, and it becomes a 3-element vector of empty character vectors. Okay, so that's a little set of things in 15.16 that you may not be aware of. Here's a couple of gotchas. These have been in the Dyalog APL since, if not day one, since the features they refer to was introduced. And this is something that I've decided to put in here after a conversation with John Scholes. First of all, not all assignments in Dyalog APL are atomic. So if you try this expression, A7B gets 1, 2, 3, A will be created. You get a syntax error because you're trying to assign 2 to 7, and the value B is not created. Okay? Been like that forever, I suspect. Fixing it is not straightforward and potentially has a fairly substantial performance implication. No one's ever complained about it, so it's somewhere down the priority stack. If anyone really wants to say we need to fix it, you're welcome to say so and we'll consider it. However, it's been in there for 30 years, it ain't going to get fixed that quick. And the other one is something in defins, again, and this is where I use Dyalog APL because I love APL, because it's my job, and because I write little systems and because I write QAs to break things. So I never use the correct terminology. So if I got the words wrong for anybody, I do apologise. In a defin, if you type something like A gets 1 followed by A gets 2, so you're either redefining A or you're reassigning to A, you might expect the old value to disappear. In a defin, what actually happens is you actually shadow the name and then you assign to it. So if you reassign to the same name, you shadow the first value of it. Okay, and that may have workspace size implications or workspace free implications. So here's a little example as a tradfin. 2000 Ibeam 1 gives an approximate workspace used value. And so what I'm doing is I'm creating in a variable that's 1,000,000 floating point numbers, then adding 1 onto that, and then I'm just assigning the value 1 to it. And if you see in here, it takes about 8 megabytes, not unreasonable. 8-byte values are 1,000,000 of them, as 8 megabytes. By the time I get to this one here, I have temporarily created a new array, assigned A, and then assigned to A, so it's not gone up in size. And then when I say A gets 1, I free out 8 megabytes of workspace. If I do that with a defin, you'll notice that the numbers go up by 8 megabytes and then up by 8 megabytes again, because I have reassigned and in that I have done a shadow, and then it goes up a little bit more when I do A is assigned 1. And it's only when I come out of that defin is that memory freed up. Okay? Should it do that? Can we do anything about it that doesn't kill the performance of defins? Interesting questions. Perhaps one for version N, where N is greater than 16, but it's been like that, I think, forever. So just be aware that you do have to be slightly careful. Reassigning, redefining names in defins does have a implication, and I think possibly functional programmers will say you shouldn't really redefine anything in the first place, so don't do it. And as a slight aside to that, again, because we shadow before we assign, and Kai found this one, it took me some time to understand it until I spoke to John. If you assign define I to be 1, and then you effectively do I gets, and then an error, in this case the error is I haven't finished the text, you get a syntax error, If you try to look at I, because it's been shadowed, you get a value error. Okay? Again, been like that for an awful long time. We may do something about it one day. This is the sort of thing you're going to hit in your development environment, and you can live with it. I think I'll skip the ride section altogether. Am I going to do that? Yes. No, I will just mention this. Ride init. In 14.1, we said to use ride, you have to define an environment variable called ride init, and you set it to be a string such as serve : 4502, which says listen to incoming ride connections on port 4502. In version 15, we have extended the 3502 Ibeam to say allow you to specify that string. So you can now do it from within the interpreter. You can only do it when ride connections are disabled. Here's a little tip from one who's done it far too many times. If you say enable ride connections and you connect ride to it, don't type that in the ride client because you promptly disconnect it. And so there's no reason why you shouldn't define one thing, disconnect it and reconnect it, or redefine the initialization string and restart. I find for my purposes when I actually fire up APL manually and connect ride to it that this is much more useful. Did I mention this? Yes. Again, I keep on banging on about this every year. For a runtime interpreter, ride is never enabled by default. You must always specify or call 3502 to enable 32 Ibeam 1 to enable it. That's mainly because if you just developed an application that uses a runtime interpreter, you probably by default don't want your users to be diving in and seeing what your APL code does. You may choose to enable that at certain points. Global quad trap, for example, that says, oh, enable it so I can hop in there and do something. Right. I'm running early for once, I believe, in my life. Amazing. So, a minute's thought, or as I frequently call it, a minute thought. Minute was a workspace that I first came across when I joined Dyalog in 1987. And it was a workspace that did a number of tests to show us how fast Dyalog APL ran on different platforms. 1987, that was the first computer I ever dealt with at Dyalog, and that was an IBM 6150, and the loop test, which basically just counts down from n down to, n is the argument to the function, down to 1. It could do about 122,000 loop tests in a minute, and it could do 2 matrix inverts. When we came to run Dyalog APL on DOS in 1990-something, we were slightly better off with the loop test, but this, I suspect, it actually had a floating point processor. It could only manage 1 matrix invert. The first 64-bit machine we ever got, mid-90s, I think, mid-late 90s? 93, okay, early 90s. That went up from 124,000 loops to 1.4 million, up to 117 matins. We were chatting about what John and Jeff were going to talk about this week. 100 by 100. So it's 100 by 100 matrix, okay. I'm inverting a 100 by 100 matrix. And I found these numbers, and just for a laugh, I ran it on the box I run my shuffle QAs on. If you remember, that's the box I have specifically that says every time Dyalog needs to get some space, it moves everything in the interpreter. So it's a fast CPU, it has very fast memory access. So within, what's that, 23 years, we've gone up to those numbers. That is what hardware and my colleagues in the development team have achieved in 20 years. 1 million to 480 million, 117 loop inverts to 60,000 of them.
And the alpha was quick.
Yes, and as you say, the alpha was quick. So, this is my take on it. 50 years of APL, where we are with Dyalog APL. It's not the end of APL, it's certainly not the end of Dyalog. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning as we move into the next generation, the next era of APL. So that's it. Thank you.